Guys, it's Andres for Absent Poker, and today we are starting a new section which is called Single Raise Pot Initiative. It's basically when we raise first in and we have the initiative. We then have to decide if we want to make a continuation bet or not. And then there are a lot of options available. Basically, we can bet to many different sizings, we can check behind, and there are many lines that we have to equilibrate. Normally, when we are playing in position, it's really easy. There are three main situations. We can play in position, basically we raise under the gun or middle or cut off a button, and we are defended by one of the blinds. Second option is that we raise in position, but then someone who is also in position will defend us, and basically we are going to play the hand out of position. Once it happens, it's really frequent that the big one is going to join us. So it will mean that we will play a three-way or more people pot. In live games, it's really normal that this happens. And then we have the final thing that can happen is that we raise in the small line and we are defended by the big one. It's a very specific spot. So we will have different lines in every single part, and we will focus mostly when we rise under the gun, between button and under the gun, and we are defended by the blinds. This is by far the most frequent spot, and this is the one that we have to play more, we have to see more in detail to improve our game. So basically the first thing that we need to know is what is the theoretical base for continuation bet, why we need to make continuation bet or not. As we saw pre-flop, when we are raising first, our opponent is going to defend based in the odds. If we raise bigger or we raise with a tighter range, our opponent's range of defense should be tighter. Instead, if we are raising and with a smaller sizing, or we are raising with a more loose range, our opponent will be defending us with a wider range. What that this means, it's going to completely change if we are defended by, let's say, a 20% of the range, or if we are defended by, let's say, 60% of the range. So basically, PO Solver can work for the most frequent situations, but then if we are raising, for example, to different sizings, or we are raising from different positions, it's not going to work that well. However, once we are raising, this situation is pretty much the same. We are raising top range, and our opponent is defending one range that does not have best hands. So basically a more merged range and a wider range, and then we are open raising a tighter range and more premium hands. So when our opponent defends to us, it's mostly based because he has good pot odds. He doesn't need to win the pot so many times. So the wins in the flop he will be lower. He doesn't need to win a lot of pots. We'll be winning, like, let's say, more than 50% of the pots by sure, and we'll be winning a lot of pots here. So our continuation bet frequency has to be higher than, let's say, 50%. When we use solvers, we will see that this is the regular way to go. Like, we're going to be making a 70% continuation bet, between 70 and 80% continuation bet. It's going to vary vastly between the different boards. For example, when I raise, I'll have an average equity of, let's say, X in the full amount of boards, but then there are some boards where I will have more equity, and there will be boards where I will have less equity. So the most important thing here is try to differentiate the boards, which is going to be my frequency of continuation bet and which will be my sizing. Once I have these two main points, which is my sizing, which is my frequency, I learn how to build my ranges. It's pretty important that we build our ranges with some of the concepts. We will see how important is the board coverage, and we will also see how important there are other concepts, like how it's going to play my hand on the turn, or if, for example, I check behind, how it's going to play in the turn, if my opponent is going to react well on the turns that I'm hitting or not. So we'll use a theoretical base, and we'll try to improve here. The last thing I want to say is that it's a kind of intuitive spot. It's pretty easy for people who are starting to play poker to become good at this spot, but it doesn't mean that they are playing perfect, and there is still also a lot of room for improvement, given that this is happening on a very frequent base. So we'll have a look on every part. First of all is how much I have to make, how often do I have to make continuation bet? It is going to be different depending on the board, and we can have a couple of rules. Basically, if I have more nuts than my opponent, then I have to make more continuation bet. Basically, for example, the board is something like Queen Jack 10, and I'm raising Ace King, and he's never defending it just by cold calling. Then I have to make a wide continuation bet because he cannot raise me. It's also more important when we are playing deep stack. Second of all is how much equity does my range has against my opponent range. If I go to the post-flop build tree and calculations, let's give me 1 second. We go here, we'll see that we have here like the expectation in position and the expectation out of position. And then we have the exploitability and all these things. So what it means is that if, for example, the average, let's say, is 32, then if it says 37, it's going to make a wider continuation bet. And it's pretty intuitive to really understand what's going to be a more, what kind of equity I have depending on the board. Also, it's important the number of draws. Like if the board is really open, I'm going to make a bigger siphons of continuation bet, and also I'll try to make a higher continuation bet. The equity of the hands is not so polarized. If we go, for example, to ace deuce, or let's say ace queen deuce, it's more normal that my hands have a lot of equity or poor equity. Here, for example, many hands have closer to 50%. So then we'll have to make a bigger siphon continuation bet. I will have to also make a wider frequency of continuation bet. Everything I'm saying is really intuitive, but we need to know so we don't have any questions about this. We need to automate all over again from here. So we'll go from the most theoretical spots to the most specific details, how I build my range and all these things that are pretty more like there is no such a big consensus in the community on how should we play. So, for example, if I go to this board, Queen 9-9, and I check, my opponent checks, I have to make a high frequency of continuation bet. It's based, as we said, basically my opponent is going to be folding a high amount to this continuation bet because he has so many hands that he still has to fold, that there is no way that he can play against this. For example, if I bet, let's say 10, let's say one big blind, he will keep folding 6-5 off, and there is no way that he can play. Even if I'm betting, even if I could bet smaller, he could not play this hand. So this is a good point to start. Basically, if my opponent has no way to defend against a small siphon of continuation bet, I will use it in my first straight. Basically, if it's really dry, or yeah, most of the times it's just because it's really dry. For example, if the board is something like 3 deuce deuce, it's not that frequent that Pio Solver will choose this siphon, and it's based that my opponent cards are always over cards, so he will have more equity, and also it's going to be more likely that the equities are not so split. It's more like they are more together. So this is the first thing that I usually use to choose my siphon of continuation bet. Then also when my opponent is folding a lot, automatically I'm going to be checking really low. Normally when I see that Pio Solver is checking, let's say less than 30%, I'm making 100% continuation bet. I basically think that in terms of efficiency, it doesn't really, it's not really good for us to try to calibrate this 30%. Is even a better strategy, try to focus on more important things. As we have been saying all the time, the most important thing is try to focus on the things that really matter. And definitely if it's 70% of continuation bet, if there is not a really clear hand that he's checking behind, I then don't use it. I just use like a regular continuation bet. We'll then think, okay, now we are talking a bit about the siphon, and we are talking also about the frequency, which are very together concepts. They go together a lot. Let's go to another very dry board. Let's say I'm going to ace king deuce. It's kind of dry on the sense that, okay, the continuation bet is not going to be that high here. What's happening here? I have all the nuts and my opponent does not. So basically, I'm going to be making a big siphon of continuation bet because my goal is try to stack off my opponent when I have, let's say, ace king or kings. I'm trying to make a bigger siphon of continuation bet. As we said, normally the assumptions that we make pre-flop can really change the outcome of the simulation. So we need to understand how it works, but we don't need to make it perfect. We need to just to understand how normally it works, and we need to be able to adapt to all situations. For example, if the board is, let's say, ace jack deuce, my opponent is also defending ace jack, or for example, I'm raising under the gun and he also has jacks pre-flop, then it's not such a good spot to be making huge continuation bet of sighting of continuation bet. If we go even to a more, let's say, queen jack 10, wait, this, I think I already spoke about this board. I check, okay, my opponent is going to be checking really low because I have so many combinations of nuts that it's going to be crazy. And also if we go, let's say, to king jack 10, it should be kind of the same because he doesn't defend his queen. For example, if I go to king queen 10, yeah, then, oh wait, yeah, it's here. Probably I cannot, well, I'm making a high continuation bet based in the fact that my opponent is folding, but as he's also defending ace jack, for example, I cannot put that many blinds into the pot because he also can defend from this just by check calling with ace jack. So there are many differences on the ways that we make the continuation bet. I think the best way to go here is try to make a strategy that covers, like, let's say 80% of what Pioseliver wants to say to you, and we can make a few rules to make this. First of all is that we are going to be making high frequency of continuation bet, low small siphon if my opponent cannot defend to this. This is going to be my first strategy. I'll be making between 25 and 40% siphon of continuation bet on a very frequent base. Also, of course, if I have a bigger average siphon of continuation bet, I'm going to be making a lower frequency of continuation bet and vice versa. It makes sense. It's like the amount of pressure that you are putting into your opponent more than a separate concept. Second of all is that if the board is really open, let's say 10-8-5 that I think we have around here, let's go not this one, not this one, yeah, this one. If I check and my opponent has to, I mean, if my opponent checks, I'm going to be making a big siphon of continuation bet. Why this happens, as we said, is just because my opponent will play, if we just bet small, he will be able to defend from this strategy just by calling with a lot of his range, and we're trying to avoid that. So we're going to be making a bigger siphon. Also, if for example I have all the nuts, I will be playing on a more aggressive way, and if for example my opponent has all the nuts, let's say, and this is something that I think people are not doing really well even in the high stakes, let's say, let's go here, for example, 7-5-4. As you know, normally you use rainbow boards because I think it's much easier to understand them. I mean, it's the same understanding them, and then when you open a flasher, it doesn't change that much. I mean, like the real concepts that we are trying to talk, they are not changing. We can see then in the turn some flasher has, but here I think it doesn't make such a big difference. Later we will speak this. Let's see, for example, here we are making not such a high continuation bet, or if we go, let's say, to 5-4-3, it's making even a lower continuation bet. I think so, yeah. And why does this happen? It's basically because my opponent has all the nuts, he has a two-pair, he's also having all the straights, and I'm not raising, for example, ace deuce off. So basically, it can also happen that in a few portion of the boards, I don't have to make such a frequent continuation bet. And as we are going to see as we saw when we were defending the big blind, we can play very aggressively against people who make too much continuation bet here. So we will try not to be this kind of people, right? We have to check the overpairs, we will see how they play in the turn and all these things. So basically this is a low portion of the boards, but it's also important to have the basic general concept that we can be making such a frequent or big amount of continuation bet, and if my opponent is aggressive, he will kill me, you understand me? So yeah, this is by far the more like the 80 or 90% of what I use when I'm playing. What else we can speak about when we are facing a check raise? is pretty easy and intuitive to play. I'm going to play into a binary strategy where I just call or fold against my opponent range. There is one small exception to this, that Pew Solver doesn't work on this. Like Pew Solver never 3-bets. It doesn't. I wouldn't say it never 3-bets, but it 3-bets really low. But if, for example, my opponent is raising, let's say, 15% on average to continuation bet, which is really high, what happens is that if I am not free betting, he's going to be raising all the time, and I'm never exploiting him. So there are two main ways to exploit the fact that my opponent is raising too much. First of all, is trying to make a lower continuation bet or a bigger siphon of continuation bet. If I'm making a bigger siphon of continuation bet, normally my opponent has to raise less. He will play a more binary call folder strategy. So my first strategy is trying to put more pressure on my opponent, just by making bigger siphons of continuation bet with a lower frequency. So I'm not going to be harmed by his raises that much. I'll polarize my range in this way. Basically, if I have a polarized range of continuation bet, my opponent can just check call or check fold. He doesn't need to raise. So basically, if my opponent is raising too much, he's never exploiting the fact that I'm making a polarized continuation bet. So I will make it. And later we will see how can we make a polarized continuation bet. So first of all, we have to do against racy people is try to make our range stronger, and then we can 3-bet the flop. Basically, let's say they raise, for example, 7-6 deuce, and he's raising all kind of sevens, even some sixes or some deuces, also all the draws and all these things. If I'm raising again with an overpair, I'm making him to call with a wide range because his range is too wide. So this is the kind of things that all the kind of adaptations that I'm going to try to do in real life. If my opponent, for example, raises really low, the most frequent thing that is going to happen is that his range is A, really polarized, and B, his range is going to be pretty strong. So I can just call once, but then if he still puts pressure on me, if he still goes aggressively, I think we can give the hands up. And I mean, like, we can play even much tighter than Pure Solver does. And most people don't do this. Like, they say, okay, he's racing, and they don't realize that his opponent is really tight in this spot. And it's pretty important. So poker evolved from 2013, 2014. People didn't raise the continuation bet. There was different lines of people. People were evolving in poker, and some of them were raising, some of them were not. Nowadays, I think most people are raising. I think that it's not that hard to defend from raise because we are going to mainly call and fold, and we can just have a look on PS Solver or Poker's Novice to see what I have to call with or not. And it's really intuitive. I have to call the pairs, I have to call the flash draws, I have to call some of the straight draws that are not bad. And also, I'll try to think how my opponent is going to play in the turn. Like, for example, if I bet a middle pair, which has, let's say, I would never bet this kind of hands, but let's say it's 10-9-5 and I have 9-7, and I bet and my opponent raised really big, my hand is not going to play really well in the turn, because when I hit my 9, he's going to just say bye to his bluffs. He's not going to keep bluffing. And when he has, let's say when I hit my 7, he has some straight draws and now are beating me. He also has some better 2-pair. So I think that we need to be smart on this way and try to adapt to what my opponent is going to do in the turn. So once we spoke, let's go back and we'll repeat. We spoke about the frequency of continuation bet and how I'm going to play against different people. We spoke about how it's going to be my siphoning, how I'm going to build it, and then we also need to speak about how I build my ranges and how can I improve on this. And this is the most important thing by far. I'm forgetting one thing, and is how I play against people who don't raise a continuation bet, how I play against people who are really tight, or how I play against people who are really loose. So basically, if my opponent is really tight, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a high frequency of continuation bet. Basically, my worst hands, my trash, can now make a continuation bet profitably because my opponent is going to fold. If I have a very low equity, even I will realize more equity by betting than by checking, because he's going to abandon too much, and this is really obvious. If my opponent is falling really low, then I have to make a lower continuation bet, and I need to make it on a bigger siphon. So I'm going to punish the fact that he's defending too much. Basically, I'll try to, when I have an opponent that is not really stream, I'll try to adapt to this, trying to choose my best combination, like some combinations that are like you don't know if you should bet big or small. Then I'll pick them to bet big if my opponent is too loose. But I'll not be making, one second, if my screen got down. I'll not be making sorry. I'll not be making a huge adaptation to my opponents. Basically, most people play pretty well. Defending the big blind is probably the most important thing that happens in poker. And when you make continuation bet, they will tend to defend pretty well. So if my opponent is not raising the continuation bet, I think I'll show you then in the when we check the hands, and I'll show you some examples. But basically, you can make 100% continuation bet. And I'll show you a pure solver then with the hands and the practical examples, and you will see how amazing it is that if your opponent is not raising, basically you are realizing 100% of the times your equity on the turn, and if you check on the river, so basically you are seeing 5 cards. When this happens, basically any card is allowed to be making a continuation bet. And for example, if you go here to post lot 3 building and calculations, and then you don't put any raise sizes, what happens is that he's going to be, as let's say you have to do it here, for example, and what is going to happen is that as your opponent cannot raise, he will be defending more. But if, for example, my opponent is defending a regular average amount and he's raising, let's say, less than 4 or 5%, then yes, I have to make any hand has to make a continuation bet, right? So next video, I'll show how I build my ranges based on pure solver, and then we'll speak a bit about. I'll speak a bit about pure solver and I mean poker snowy and all these things.